Hey, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we believe that another world is still possible, and that together we can make it happen. I'm Amanda Scott, and I spent the first series of this podcast laying out the basic toolkit that we think is essential to making conscious evolution a possibility, which is the entire premise behind the whole Accidental Gods project, this podcast, the website, and the membership program that lies behind it. Since then, we've been exploring the extraordinary, inspiring intersection where art meets activism, politics meets philosophy, and science meets spirituality, from which we can craft a vision of a future that is generative for everyone, for the human and the more than human worlds. My guest this week is an author and innovator, an activist and a philosopher with ideas that are world-changing. Jeremy Lent was a businessman, but life changes that he will talk about shifted his perspective, and he went on a search that lasted many years for the meaning of life. Sense-making has become a bit of a buzzword in our corner of the internet, but Jeremy has brought a sharp mind and deep embodied practice to a making of sense that has the potential, I think, to transform us all. His published book, The Patterning Instinct, is a history of who we are and how we got here, and he has a new one coming out in the spring called The Web of Meaning, an integration of modern science with traditional wisdom, which sounds very much like the kind of thing that this podcast would celebrate. So, we began a little raggedly, without our usual sharp start. We were reflecting on Extinction Rebellion, the action that's happening as we recorded, and the fact that we were both part of the action in London last October. And in the end, I chose not to cut that out. So, with our somewhat relaxed start, people of the podcast, please welcome Jeremy Lent.
Yes, I was just checking in on what's going on with the rebellion, and I guess there were like 300 people arrested yesterday or the day before.
Yes, I think so. The interesting thing is, I don't know about your media, but the BBC is treating it as if it's not happening, which is deeply distressing.
Yes, I had to search, to find the one little article, even in The Guardian. It's certainly not there on the sort of main feed. I read The Guardian every day, the sort of US version, but there was just not there. I had to really search on the web to find any mention about it.
Yeah, I think if you've got XR on your feed, it will come up. But otherwise, I was there for the October Rebellion. I think you were there.
Yes.
You in the October Rebellion last year, weren't you? Because you did that video.
I was, yes. I was able to speak to the group for 15 minutes or so before the police did another of their movements in to try to...
Yes, please move on. And that was videoed and it's online and I will share it. But this time, they're moving people much faster and much harder. And last time, I was part of the group that sat outside the BBC for pretty much all of the first Friday of the first week. And I can see why they didn't report that, because then anyone who chooses to sit in the steps of the BBC suddenly becomes newsworthy, and that's a very steep downward spiral. But they didn't report any of it. And they're not doing it again. And we have this pretense that we have a neutral public broadcaster, and we just don't. So that's part of the problem that we will have to address. So let's pretend we haven't just started. Jeremy Lent, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. Thank you for this. I read your book way back when I was doing the Masters in Regenerative Economics at Schumacher, and the head of department put it in my hands and said, "You have to read this. You will love it." That was The Patterning Instinct. And I did, and I did. And now I've been reading your blog about the ecological civilization, and it feels to me that of all the people I'm reading, you have the most coherent concept of a way forward. So welcome, and I look forward to talking about that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Amanda. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thanks, and thanks for the kind words about the book.
Everybody will run out and read it, I hope. So let's go back a little bit and start more or less at the beginning of your beginning to think about how we might go forward? Because you did an MA at Cambridge and then an MBA in the States?
Yes, actually, it was just a BA at Cambridge,
Oh,
but
okay.
that's exactly right, in English literature. And then I left England and came to the States. This is back in 1981, at the time of Thatcher's
Wow.
uh,
Yes.
Thatcher's neoliberal takeover of England. And yeah, I just kind of felt I wanted to explore the world. England just felt so limited to me growing up there, and just like still living in the past in the Commonwealth and the Empire, and then with Thatcher's, just horrible. All the horrible things she was bringing. What I didn't realize, of course, is that I came to the States thinking it was some sort of. I was transfixed by the films from Woodstock and stuff like that, and then had no idea I was landing in Reagan's America, even worse than anybody could dream about. But I ended up with somebody who I later married, who had been all through the hippie era and had traveled all over South America. And I spent time with her in Central America, which was very formative for me in the mountains of Guatemala with the indigenous people.
Wow.
But then she had two sons who became my stepsons, wanted to settle down. So we kind of agreed, well, let me go do an MBA. And in the words we used at the time, let's go into the belly of the beast for a few years and give a sort of solid sort of background for the two sons to grow up and have a good start in life. That was the idea behind this redirection of my life that took place, which it was a very strange thing when I look back on it, because it wasn't where I expected I was going to go when I was a student at Cambridge. But as you say, I ended up getting an MBA in the absolute heart of neoliberalism, the University of Chicago. It's the home of Milton Friedman.
Yes, and the whole neoliberal school basically came from Chicago. It's called the Chicago School. And so were you you were completely imbued with neoliberal concepts being there, or were there more radical people?
Yes, well, that's what's so interesting. On the one hand, I always maintained some sort of sense of values different from that whole business ethos. On the other hand, it did have an impact on me. Like so many others, I did get transfixed by this sort of alchemy of this way of thinking, that actually the free market works so well, and it works for everyone's benefit, and by everyone pursuing their selfish ends. The whole system is more efficient, and that works for everyone's good. And that made sense to me. It was drummed into me so much that I actually believed it.
Yeah.
Which, as I look back and now, I say, how could I? How could I? But I think it's interesting because it does show me the power of ideas to really sort of set the frame for what people believe is good. And the thing is, what is so seductive about that way of thinking is that what it tells people is that they can be selfish, look out for themselves, and that's a good thing to be doing. So you can feel morally justified by being like a selfish person taking advantage of others. And I think that's why it's so seductive for people. They can actually pursue these kind of drives that our society instills in people and actually feel good about it.
And not only is it morally good, it's part of your heritage that you cannot escape. I think it's an incredibly seductive narrative of this is who you are, and if you are very, very good at it, then you are the best of people.
Yes. That's right. That's right. So you can, and of course, the downside of that narrative is for the vast majority of people who are shut out of the sort of escalators of power basically the escalators, because all you got to do is step on it, and once you're there, you don't really have to move a muscle, and you just automatically find yourself in this place of privilege. But for the vast majority of people shut out of it, then they're told not just that it's not fair, and they feel the sense of envy, but they instill in themselves this notion that it's their fault. So they feel really bad about themselves, and that just opens them up for this kind of fascistic way of thinking, of pointing fingers at others, and hate and self-hate turns into hate for those who are not like you, and all those horrible situations we're seeing right now.
And there's a very odd kind of doublethink, which is definitely coming to the surface now, which is we, the white supremacists, believe that certain people are genetically superior to other people. So basically, white men are superior to anyone who isn't male and isn't white. And yet, at the same time, we can hold this belief system that says if anybody works hard enough, they can get themselves to the top, because that then excuses the total excess of behavior that we display. And there doesn't seem to be any mismatch between these. I couldn't hold both of those simultaneously. I wouldn't want to hold either one of them. But I keep coming up against people who seem to be able to hold them both, which including the entire government of the United Kingdom at the moment, which is kind of interesting. I think nobody's ever really questioned it in a way that they've heard the questions. But anyway, let's move on. So because I had gleaned from the biographies that I read that you were in the belly of the beast because that's where you wanted to be. But actually, it sounds like you were in there as an insurgent from the beginning. But then you set up a company.
Exactly. I think really what my story kind of shows is that if you can go into that world with good intentions, but when you are surrounded by it day in, day out, year after year, those good intentions easily get eroded. But yes, I did. I started my own company during the first internet wave. It was actually a credit card company. It was the first company ever to allow people to apply for a credit card online and get approved in real time.
Oh, well done.
And it was a big success. And I got this blue chip venture capital funding. I was the CEO, and took the company public and did the whole sort of thing, this whole IPO. And things it was a little bit like sort of becoming a rock star, you know, like, so all of a sudden, like, who is this person? You don't even recognize yourself, and you sort of see yourself on TV or in the articles or whatever. But then all of this crashed around me quite soon after the IPO. My wife at the time, and she died some years back, she got quite seriously ill with some of the things that ended up causing her death. And I wanted to really look after her. So I sort of cut back the time I was with the company, and then I just basically left. I stayed around as the sort of on the board, but I left my full-time position as CEO to look after her. Okay. And I left the company too early, when it was still in its early stage. And within a year or two, it really started falling apart. And meanwhile, my wife was suffering severe cognitive decline as a sort of a result of some of what she was suffering. And so I kind of lost her. So even though I was looking after her for a lot of years after that, the person I had loved and known was really no longer there. So I was so isolated. I had virtually no network of friends. I'd left people behind that I'd been close to in those earlier years, and felt like everything I'd built around my life was crashing around me. And this was a moment of deep transformation for me. And I sort of realized I still had a life ahead of me. It wasn't like my life was over by any means, but I had this kind of choice, really, like, where am I going to redirect my life? And I vowed to myself at that time that whatever path I took was going to be truly meaningful. But I'd realized that this path that I had taken was a dead end, really. And I'd built my values, my ideas around things that other people had told me, rather than really understanding for myself what was meaningful. So then this began this whole journey for me of trying to understand, well, where does meaning actually come from?
Yes.
And these ideas we're told about, whether it's, I could throw out this whole idea of this neoliberal ideology, but anything we're told about, if I wanted to sort of let my soul be fulfilled, well, what is my soul? What does that even mean? And
Yes.
where, what are the things that we're told in Western culture? Where do these ideas actually come from? So I started doing this multi-year research project, basically, just reading just anything I could get my hands on, to a little bit like a detective puzzle. Like, where does if I'm looking at some idea, like the sort of separation between mind and body, well, why is that? Why do some cultures not think that? Others do.
Right.
And so it was like peeling the onion, and I began to go back in time, all the way to earliest sort of ancient Greek ideas, and then all the way back to early indigenous ideas. And then I started to look at the sort of scientific takes on things, and came across the whole sort of Richard Dawkins reductionist type of approach, that ultimately we're all just about selfish genes, and ultimately the universe has no meaning whatsoever. And something in me I just couldn't accept that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I felt in my core being that that was just plain wrong.
Brilliant.
But I also wanted to make sure that whatever I believed in as meaningful was really coherent. To your point you just made earlier, I wasn't willing to hold things in my head that didn't fit together. So this was a real puzzle to me. And then as I was really deep in this research, it began to come together. And I began to recognize how wrong those reductionists were. And began to recognize a different way of understanding meaning.
Brilliant. And it seems to me that what you are doing is single-handedly trying to answer the big question of humanity, which is, what are we here for?
Right.
And that you've gone about it, you have a Cambridge education, so you have gone back to the absolute roots of what humanity is and explored what meaning has been for people down the ages. And I read your book, and you go right back to when we were all forager hunters, and then through the agrarian millennia to where we are now. And we could look a little bit about that in a minute, but I'm wondering, along the way there, did you find a sense of meaning that was personal to you, that you can get up in the morning and this powers you through the day?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And the answer is yes. And largely that was driven by a parallel path of discovery that I was on. And while I was doing all this reading, I was also doing my own embodied exploration of meaning.
Right.
And that involved all kinds of paths. One of the most important for me was just discovering meditation, which for most of my life, if you'd asked me what meditation was, I would have really had no idea, like some sort of mystic state you get in or whatever. And once I actually discovered it, it felt like a real coming home. And it really transformed my sense of being in my own consciousness. And I meditate regularly to this day, and I'm just so grateful for that amazing tradition that is there.
Which tradition do you follow?
Well, my kind of meditation is mostly the Buddhist-based sort of mindfulness meditation.
Yeah, the Vipassana.
But without necessarily having any religious trappings. So there's a sort of like secular Buddhist type of approach, which speaks to me, even though there are issues about that sort of way of approaching Buddhism. And I don't call myself a Buddhist, but I very much respect and love that tradition, and a lot of what I believe is meaningful arises from what I've learned from that tradition. So that was one very important form, and also more embodied approaches. I discovered what is really kind of big in California and also other places around the world, this notion of conscious dance, where you just kind of dance, and you don't try to do that in some formal way of learning steps or whatever, but really get in touch with your body in community with others around you with music. And that was hugely liberatory for me. And traditional Chinese practices. Qigong is something that I just, again, when I first discovered Qigong, had no idea what it was. And the very first day I did a session, I felt I was at home. I felt this is the feeling that it felt like as if I'd felt it all my life, but never knew what it was. And it's something else that I do every day now, and I'm incredibly grateful for. I think to me, it's as important as meditation, as a way of really feeling a sense of integrative being with yourself in a meaningful way.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yes. And for people listening, I think one of the things that we try and emphasize in the podcast is the difference between declarative knowing and performative knowing. And declarative is, I know that meditation is a really good idea, and I can list all of the really amazing things that it would do to my physiology and my neurochemistry and my blood pressure and all of those things. And performative knowing is actually sitting down and doing it. And you've done that. You've done all of the embodied work, which sounds glorious. Is the dance, just for my own interest, is that linked to the five rhythms work?
Absolutely, yes. It's a larger sort of practice area, of which five rhythms is one approach to that. But
Okay.
yeah, five rhythms is definitely one of the richest
Okay.
approaches to that kind of conscious dance.
Brilliant. Sounds amazing. I want to come to California. So and all of this, just again, for my own curiosity, your stepsons were growing up or had grown up and left home by then?
During this time, yeah, they had left home at that point. When one was in college, and one was already actually a doctor, and already had his own family. So
Right.
that's why I was even more isolated,
Right.
really on my own during this kind of period of transformation.
Okay, and you dealt with it. I'm very impressed. A lot of us faced with a double collapse like that, I think would slide into the slough of despond rather fast. But you chose to see it as a time of growth. And so, having done the embodied practice, having found the personal meaning that arises out of that, where did that take you? Because at some point, presumably, the research stopped, and the being active and sharing the results of your research began.
Yes. Well, as I was doing this research, one of the things I was doing in the first few years was looking for a book or some writer or some kind of book that would help to map out for me what I was looking for. It would help to take me through where these different ideas came from and peel the onion for me. And I guess I began to realize that book wasn't there. And
Yep.
I thought, well, maybe I should do that myself for others who were on a similar kind of path of inquiry and discovery. So that's actually where the patterning instinct came from, was this realization at some point that by putting all these pieces together, I could not just help myself to make sense of things, but offer something of value, hopefully of value to the world.
Yeah.
And really what I was putting together was not just that book, The Patterning Instinct, but the book that I've just finished writing right now, that's actually going to be published next spring, called The Web of Meaning,
Oh,
integrating
brilliant.
science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. And originally, these two books were going to be one, but the topics got
Huh.
so big, I realized there was no way that could happen. And
Yes.
so the patterning instinct really looks historically at how different cultures have made meaning out of the universe, all the way from
Hmm.
hunter-gatherer times, as you mentioned, to the present day. And as I was doing that research and I was beginning to put things together myself, it began to dawn on me that the ways in which our current society had mismanaged this process of meaning making, essentially, um, has become so consequential, the imbalance is so extreme, that it's actually putting our very civilization at risk and is causing massive, horrendous devastation for the natural world, while it's also causing horrendous misery for the vast bulk of humanity. And it took me a while, because of the fact, as we talked about, when I was in that business world, I was just not that aware of some of the environmental devastation going on around, and just reading the
Hmm.
mainstream media, just like everybody else, not getting it. And I began to look deeper and understand what was going on. I got to be driven by an absolute imperative to do anything I could in my life to try to redirect where our culture and civilization is going. And that's really what I
Brilliant.
see my life as being about right now. I do see myself at this point, um, and it really is a kind of an agent for life. And this is not to put myself up as somebody special. I believe millions of us around the world, waking up to what's going on, see themselves
Yeah.
in a very, very similar place. Just look at the horror of what's happening, feel how wrong that is, and are really dedicating themselves to transforming for in the interests of life, in the interests of humanity, in the interests of future generations. And so I just really see myself as one of those people really devoted to what I can, along with others, to transform our direction.
And you are acting as a trailblazer, I think. And particularly, I am so looking forward to the book that's published in the spring. Who's your publisher?
It's actually two publishers. In the UK, it's Profile Books, who are
Okay.
wonderful independent press who really get behind progressive ideas a lot. And in
Brilliant.
North America, it's New Society Publishers.
You've evolved the web of meaning, which is the title of your book, and you've evolved this concept of an ecological civilization as the next step of human civilization and how we might get there. So can we begin to have a look at what it is that we could be if the millions of us who want to be agents for life were able to make that happen, perhaps in the face of and in spite of those who don't quite get it yet?
Yes, I think that is so important because one of the things we need so much is to be aware of the possibilities that do exist in the future. It's very easy to see the devastation around us right now and to see what's wrong. It's
Yeah,
much harder to see what's possible in a positive future because that's very rarely talked about. And in the
sure
frames of
is.
our culture, it's almost impossible to even envisage something like that.
Yeah. And yet, if we can't envisage it, we can't get to it.
Yes.
That's the key, isn't it? If we don't know where we're going, we won't get there.
There's this sense like, well, we don't want to get too idealistic because then it becomes unrealistic and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
what I've begun to realize is that actually what is unrealistic is maintaining any sense of trying to incrementally improve things in our current
Mm.
destructive paradigm and believe that that can lead to a positive outcome. That's what's
Yep.
truly unrealistic. What is
Yes.
realistic is to realize how deeply wrong things are and to realize that there is a possibility of change, but only if we transform at the deepest levels, deepest layers.
Okay.
So, yeah, so this idea of an ecological civilization, it's inspired by the indigenous wisdom that's been around for millennia. So it's not exactly like a new idea. It's really a very old idea, but it's one that in recent decades, a few leading thinkers have begun to sort of piece together what could be possible under a different kind, if we had a civilization under a different kind of foundation. And the simple framing idea behind it is if we look at our current civilization and we realize that ultimately it's based on wealth accumulation, it's based on extraction, it's based on a sense of separation. And the fundamental of it is you're meant to, and everything is the power structures, everything is based on extracting wealth. And an ecological civilization would be based on one that is life affirming. So it's
Mm.
the foundation itself is what actually affirms life. And the concept is that the way in which we structure the civilization uses the same kind of principles that life itself has evolved over literally billions of years on Earth to develop its own stable, rich, healthy ecologies, which, if they were left alone away from human depredation, can last for millions and millions of years, always in health, always changing along with the environment, but always remaining kind of
Mm.
stable at the same time. What would it be like if we actually structured our civilization on that kind of basis?
And how would we go about doing that? Because this is, in a way, it's a biomimicry or even a cosmomimicry. I read a paper about cosmomimicry the other day, that we would be following patterns that already exist within the natural world. But in a practical level, how can we begin to make that happen? Or let's take a step ahead. What would it look like when we get there, if we begin to do that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great place to begin. And before I do that, by the way, I was just curious, was it a paper by Freya Matthews that you were reading about? She wrote this great paper. She's an ecological philosopher. She wrote this great paper looking at biomimicry just from a much deeper perspective than people usually do.
I would need to go and look it up. It was called Cosmomimicry. I have read so many things in the last few days.
Right.
I'll go and find it, and I'll find a link, and I will send it to you. It could have been. And if not, I need to read the Freya Matthews, because there is so much,
yes,
I think, richness and depth in the whole biomimicry concept. But yes.
Exactly. That's right. So anyway, to get to your question, well, I guess maybe the first thing to do is look at some of the core principles of how that civilization would be structured, and then say, well, in practice, what does that actually mean? So in terms of the principles, really like the same sort of principles that have enabled ecologies to thrive for so long, that one of the fundamental principles is simply called symbiosis, which is this recognition that the way that life actually evolved its complexity is by different parts of living systems, different organisms, working out how they could offer something to another organism, so that it was a win-win situation, so that together they were able to help each other. And rather than a sort of zero-sum game, like, that we're told in the sort of selfish gene concept, like everyone's out to beat everybody else. And that's actually not how evolution works. How it actually works is by different entities getting together and sharing their particular skills to create something bigger that is better for all. And so simple examples of that would be how, like, fungi, take all the debris and detritus of plants and animal matter, and they reorganize that to make the soil fertile for plants. And other simple things is like plants are superb at photosynthesis, but then they need help in moving their seeds around. So then they offer nutrition to animals, who then in turn move the seeds of the plants to enable the whole ecology to strengthen. And every single element of life is like that. We work together to create something better. So that's the way that an ecological civilization would work. And one of the principles that comes from that is that in an ecological civilization and in an ecology, the health of the overall system relies on all the different individual parts also being healthy. So rather than one group trying to take advantage of the other group, there's this recognition that all the different elements together rely on each other's flourishing for a full flourishing ecosystem. There's a concept that I call it fractal flourishing, which is basically like, probably people are familiar with this notion of fractals. They're like patterns in nature that repeat themselves at multiple scales, from tiny patterns within a cell all the way to an ecosystem. And fractal flourishing is simply this recognition that when the smaller parts are flourishing, the whole system flourishes, and it works reciprocally in both directions. So imagine a civilization that was like that, where the flourishing of every individual actually matters in order for the society as a whole to be healthy. And when the society as a whole is healthy, it helps, of course, individual groups to flourish themselves. So like another principle in ecological health is diversity. So rather than this kind of system where everything is meant to be homogenized, or where one sort of McDonald's paradigm or one sort of Uber paradigm works well, so that it applies flatly across the whole world. In a truly diverse ecosystem, all the different unique elements actually, by pursuing their uniqueness, become part of the richness, a harmonic richness of the whole system. So the system as a whole gets to be just fuller and healthier by really recognizing, embracing, and celebrating diversity. So those are some examples of that, and we could go on, but maybe I could move a little bit now. We've just touched on some of those principles to what an ecological civilization might actually look like in
Yes,
sort
please do.
of real
Yes.
practical terms. Well,
Yes.
one thing is that we'd be looking at a situation where you have circular economies, where so when we were making things, manufacturing things, it would be done with a sense, just like in an ecosystem, where the waste products of one process become the food for another process, so that it may not be possible to be 100% circular in that regard, just because of the sort of the kind of law of entropy or whatever, but vastly close to that possibility. We're able to make sure that things are produced not just to reduce or eliminate pollution, but to actually regenerate the earth. And this is this amazing, if we go back to this notion of symbiosis, in symbiosis, you don't sort of relates to the other agent or the other entity by saying, how can I reduce harm to that entity? But how can I make that entity actually healthier so then it's good for me? And similarly, it would be processing things so that they actually made the natural world and the environment around healthier rather than just less polluted. So a regenerative
Yes.
economy. So that's one big concept. When you apply that to agriculture, you'd have none of this monocropping that we see right now that is absolutely destroying the living earth. But instead, you'd have regenerative agriculture, agroecology. There's this amazing practice of permaculture, which really, once again, just leverages off the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous cultures throughout the millennia, but also applies modern scientific principles to that, which looks at how you can actually stack functions in a particular place so that you can actually produce far more goodness with virtually no negative effects through these kind of processes than monocropping, which uses fossil fuels for fertilizer and then creates these horrible, massive dead zones in the oceans that destroys life in the ocean too.
Yeah, and strip mines the soil so that there's nothing actually left to grow in.
It's this extractive way of approaching the living earth in a way that just destroys it, just for short-term benefit and short-term profits. And you will see countless articles written out there by these gigantic big ag companies, or people who are in their pay, or people who just have been manipulated by them to believe it, to think that this form of monocropping is necessary to feed the world, if you will, the 7.5 billion people in the world and population growth, or how else can people get fed? And that is just this myth, because in fact, there have been studies showing that agroecology, regenerative agriculture, when applied properly, is far more productive with, of course, far less waste. So that would be a huge part of an ecological civilization.
Yes. So how do we get there? Because it seems to me so Amsterdam just became the first city to take on board the donut economic model and to endeavor to become a regenerative city. Regenerative agriculture in the last 5 years has become a reasonable buzzword, to the extent that Farmers Weekly in the UK, which is not one of the most progressive journals one could see, but it devoted an entire issue to regenerative agriculture. So it's beginning to take off. But it seems to me that one of the things standing in the way was something that you mentioned in a YouTube that you did, which is that 69 of the biggest 100 economic units in the world are transnational companies. And they are utterly devoted to extractive profit, as far as I can tell, and they wield a lot of power. And some of them are beginning to come. I think there's a thing called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation over here, which is devoted to helping companies become circular in their way of working. But they still need shareholder value. They still have a fiduciary duty to pay their shareholders. How are we going to step from here to there? Do you have an idea of that?
I do, and I'm so glad you raised this, because I think it's one of the biggest elephants in the room, if you will, that people rarely talk about. It's so vast that people don't even want to look at it. And the reality is, just as you say, these transnational corporations at this point, they literally control every element of the human experience. They control our culture, they control our media, through the massive political corruption. They now control most of the political structures of the world, including, of course, in the country I'm in the US and in the UK. And they control all the other parts, the finance, no matter where you go. What is so terrible about this is this drive for shareholder value it's pathological. In the United States, corporations are allowed to be considered as persons, which is this absurd thing. It gives them even more power in politics.
But they're not actually taxed as if they were people. It's another of these interesting double things.
I mean, it's all these structures are there designed to give them as much power as possible. But the reality is that if they were really persons, they would be sociopaths. Because to your point, they're driven only by one thing, which is shareholder profit and increasing shareholder profit at all costs. And if that were a person, they would be ready to break rules, have no empathy, basically just on this path of destruction. And if you're lucky enough to recognize that person's a sociopath or a psychopath, you stay away from them. We can't stay away from
or you elect them to run your country.
Exactly. And in fact, it has been shown that if you look at senior executives and politicians, there is a much, much higher percent of sociopaths and psychopaths in that group than in the population at large, which itself is a terrifying statistic. So what we absolutely have to do is recognize that power, start talking about it, and look at ways to undo that power. And there are simple ways. And the thing is, they involve, because that power is so strong, people can't even think about them. But it's really quite simple, because if a human being has something wrong with their DNA, it's very difficult to change that. You can change through culture, but you can't actually go in and change their DNA. But with corporations, you can do that. You can actually, through laws, you can change the way they're structured. There's this concept that seemed hopeful at first, but then got to seem ineffective, was what's called the triple bottom line, which is, and there you can actually have a corporation called a B corporation or a benefit corporation, where you can actually change your charter to say, we are going to have a triple bottom line of not just profits, but also people and planets, meaning that we are actually going to be legally obligated as a corporation to manage for our employees, for the people who live in in the areas where we do our work, and for the environment, for the planet as a whole. Now, so that seems, well, okay, that sounds great. But the problem is, as long as that's voluntary, it's meaningless, because the playing field is dominated by these corporations that don't have these other bottom lines. And so it's almost impossible, even if you're a good person as a CEO and you want to do good, you're not going to keep your job if there's an ability to sort of buy some sort of copper mine somewhere in the global south, and you have to involve in corruption to buy it. You have to basically pay slave labor wages, and the cheaper form of extraction involves causing massive pollution. And if as a good person you say, no, we're not going to do all those things, well, you're going to miss out on the opportunity to buy that mine. Your shareholder price will go down, and you'll lose your job. So what has to be done is we have to change the laws, saying that corporations are only there as a result of governments actually initially allowing them to be incorporated, to do what they do. You can change the laws to say they can only be incorporated under that triple bottom line. So they have to actually look out for the benefit of the planet and the benefit of the people, their employees, and all people affected by them, including the consumers who buy their goods. And that has to have teeth in it. So you have to have some kind of system that they have to have those charters renewed every few years. And if they haven't met those three bottom lines, then they lose their charter. and they go out of business. And having been a CEO and knowing what you think about when you're a CEO, if you knew that you were literally going to lose your charter if you didn't meet those bottom lines, you would actually go out of your way to make sure you did. And we'd see this incredibly powerful force for destruction in our world right now could be basically harnessed and moved in a different kind of direction.
So we have the snake eating its own tail at the moment, though, because the transnational corporations hold the reins of political power. They hold the media, as you said. As we said right at the top, the BBC is not mentioning Extinction Rebellion. They're offering the kind of bland pabulum that keeps the government happy, or keeps the public happy with the government. How are we going to get to a point where we can change those laws? Because what I'm watching in the UK, and I think in the US, are the extractivist instincts pushing the current governments are changing laws in the opposite direction faster than they have ever been changed.
Right.
They're removing all restrictions on extraction and wealth gathering, as if it's kind of become a frenzy, a sort of end of world feeding frenzy, as far as I can tell, of we have to take as much as possible before it all falls over. And I wonder if they've all secretly read Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper and they're just deciding to enrich themselves as fast as is humanly possible before it all goes really, really bad. And yet Mondragon exists, and yet there are small, thriving community bakeries, say, all over the world. There are things that were growing during COVID lockdown, little green shoots of people actually beginning to build communities to really work with their local community supported agriculture in a regenerative way. So the things are happening. But if we can't change the laws at the top, I'm not certain they're going to happen fast enough. Do you have ideas of how we can reach the people who hold the power and persuade them to do things differently?
I think that the changes that need to happen ultimately will only happen when there is massive, massive grassroots movement coordinated around the world, just telling the status quo, this is unacceptable, this is not going to happen anymore. And I think that the kind of actions we're seeing through Extinction Rebellion are the beginnings of what we need. And the Extinction Rebellion gives me tremendous amount of hope, because it's actually, and even though it's of course it's got its issues and deals with controversies and all kinds of things, but that's to be expected, because the more successful you are in having an impact, the more you're going to be dealing with complexities as you have more and more of a larger impact on change.
Yeah.
But this is what we actually need. We need to see things like the school children movement following Greta Thunberg last year can just explode out of the blue, because people are driven ultimately by their heart.
Yeah.
And so for any individual person, I think the transformation begins with your heart. It begins with this sense of what you know is right, the sense of that life and caring for future generations and caring for other human beings around you and caring for the natural world, that is actually good. And that matters. And that's worth transforming things around in order to really strive for life.
Yeah.
And if you begin with your heart like that, then it takes a level of just simply looking at the drivel and the lies that are put out there in the media and just realizing how far that is from what your heart is actually telling you.
Yeah.
And then it gets to be a lot about connection, realizing that there are so many others around who actually care in the same way, and making those connections, because none of us is going to do anything on our own. It's only through being part of bigger and bigger networks that we're actually going to see these changes happening. And I think that the transformation really can happen at a different level, different layers, all interacting at the same time for each of us. So one of those transformations has to happen within us. We've got to believe in what's possible, believe in life. And that doesn't mean necessarily being optimistic. I've had a number of interactions with Jem Bendel on that topic. And, he and I agree on a lot. But there is a slight difference, I think, in our outlook, in the sense that I believe that it's not about sort of putting odds on how likely is it that things are going to end up okay or not, but it's about actually having hope, not hope as a form of optimism, but hope as a way of living into each day. Hope is more like as an active verb of just knowing that there's a mystery in the future. We don't know what's going to happen. There's far too much complexity to ever actually, put odds on, is civilization going to collapse 10 years from now, 100 years from now? If it does collapse in our current form, which obviously is very likely in some way or other, what's going to take its place? None of us know, but we do know that what we do is part of building into that future. So that's the kind of hope I'm talking about, is just believing in the mystery and knowing that as an agent of life, each of us has the ability to actually co-create that future.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Excellent. Yeah. And so you have written about Liology. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, you are.
Which is basically, as I understand it, about the co-creating of a future. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, for sure. Well, Liology is a word that I coined to describe a different worldview, if you will, a different way of making meaning out of the universe, which looks at our intrinsic connectivity. And it actually comes from an ancient Chinese word, Li, which means literally the organizing principles by which all of the qi, which is like all the matter and energy of the world, connects up with each other. So Li is really about the organizing principles of connection. And the word ology, of course, is a Greek word, a Greek-based word meaning like the study of.
Logos.
So the idea, the very word itself, Liology, combines traditional Asian thought with Western scientific ideas. And so it's very much an embodied framework. It's this recognition of our deep interconnectedness, and that to understand things, to your point that you said at the beginning of this podcast, it's not just about understanding it intellectually, but understanding it from our embodied existence as well, in a fully integrative way. And so the framework is all about integration and realizing that there is no one part of our lives that's actually separate from everything else, that we live in a universe of deep interpenetration where everything ultimately depends on everything else. There's this Buddhist concept of dependent origination, which is very similar to that. And there's this beautiful concept put out by Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist teacher, he calls interbeing. Which is really what Liology is about, that everything exists as a result of everything else. And so each of us as individuals are part of this interconnected web of meaning, essentially. So the framework really is just looking at the different skills and traditions from traditional cultures, as well as modern scientific insights from systems science and complexity theory, evolutionary biology, to form an integrated framework of understanding that could really allow us to make meaning of the world in a way that our current reductionist paradigm doesn't allow.
Yes. And so if we could create a narrative based on the Liology and bring that out into the greater narrative, because we started at the beginning talking about Thatcher and Reagan, and what they did very cleverly was there is no alternative, to shape it as if this was the way the world was, and all you could do was work within that framework. And what seems very exciting to me with your Liology idea is that if we could begin to normalize that, it breaks down the concept that there is no alternative. It makes it obvious that there has always been an alternative, and we've just been kind of lured by the bright, flashy, shiny things to look in one particular direction, but we could instead look around us and grieve at the devastation and yet have hope as a way of moving forward. So I will direct people to your blog. Is there a community built around Liology? Are you finding ways of getting this out into the world, or is your book intended to do that?
This new book, The Web of Meaning, is in some ways a sort of a launch pad for this framework of Liology. I don't actually use the word Liology in it because I just wanted the book itself to be just more available to anybody without people going, oh, am I meant to, is this some new belief system or something, or all that kind of stuff. But it really is the launch pad of this different kind of framework. And in terms of Liology, here in the Bay Area, for a number of years, I've given workshops which actually explores Liology, which are really fun because they're this kind of integrative workshop where a little bit of guided meditation, a little bit of qigong, some dance, and then focused conversations around topics either coming from traditional Chinese or Buddhist wisdom or coming from modern systems thinking and understanding how that affects our lives. And in the future, actually, probably starting next year, I might start to offer some of these workshops online in webinar formats so that we can have a bigger, really sort of start to expand these ways of thinking.
Brilliant.
But above all, I love what you're saying is that this is a response to this notion there is no alternative. There absolutely is an alternative. There is a way of living our lives that are deeply meaningful. There's a way of structuring our society and civilization that can be life-affirming. And there is a possibility for us ultimately to move from this Anthropocene, this period of human supremacy and extractivism destroying the earth, to what some people are calling the Symbiocene, like a far longer period, one that could last for millennia and just indefinitely into the future, where humans and the living earth actually work regeneratively together, where we have a healthy and a rich natural world, and humans themselves are able to not to try to go back to the past, to still develop technology, to look into the future, but to do so in a way that totally transforms our way of living, so that rather than technology being about how to control nature, technology would be about how to integrate with these deep natural processes of billions of years and allow true flourishing for humans and life on Earth.
That is amazing.
And that is possible. We just need to persuade enough people around us to look into themselves, to feel into what's real, and to work together to get rid of this destructive, really suicidal collective pathology that is rampaging right now.
Brilliant. Yes, which is exactly what this podcast is all about. Thank you. So if we were going to offer the people listening a couple of things they could do here and now, when they switch off the podcast, go out into the world, have you any ideas of things that we could do actively to get this going, other than reading The Patterning Instinct and waiting for your new book, which we will do?
Well, thank you so much. Well, I think that one of the most valuable things to do is to really look to connect with others, because these transformations really take place in community. And, our whole current mindset is all about the individual and individual freedom and individual autonomy and all these things that end up being so self-destructive. And this different way of looking at things is about connecting. And so one of the best ways to do that is to connect first with your own heart. What is really meaningful to you? And then through that to connect with others who also share in those ways of feeling about things.
Brilliant.
And then to look at the different layers in which you can connect. So one is with community, and looking at its one of the core things is to working to transform your own community in ways that are life-affirming. But at the same time, not to just close to the larger national and global implications of everything that's going on, and to look at ways in which you can connect up with movements such as Extinction Rebellion or others that are out there that are truly making a difference on this kind of global system, and to not allow that sense of sort of doom and gloom to disempower you. To remember that just plays into the hands of those very destructive forces that are destroying things. And to realize that to feel into the depth of what is going wrong, recognize how bad that is, but then recognize that we do not know what the future holds, but that what each of us does is actually what's going to create that future together.
Yes. That's an incredibly good place to stop, because we've pretty much reached our hour. And if everybody listening to this could go out and do that, then the world would be a different place, because the ripples will ripple outwards. It doesn't take a huge number of people who really are committed to change to make that change happen. So, Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. We will all do what we can to be part of the transforming future. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, man. It was great speaking with you today. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
So that's it for another week. Enormous thanks to Jeremy for his promise of hope for a different future and an ecological civilization that lives regeneratively in harmony with the earth. We will be back next week with another conversation. And if you ever have ideas of people you would like to hear on the podcast, please do get in touch. You will find me at Manda with an M, that's MANDA, at accidentalgods.life. In the meantime, ever thanks to Caro C for the music at the head and foot of the podcast and for the sound production. Thanks, as always, to Faith Tilleray for being the other half of the creative team that is Accidental Gods, and for designing the website. If you want to visit us, we are at accidentalgods.life on the web. You will find the show notes there, the other podcasts, the visualizations and meditations in the resources section, and ways to join the Accidental Gods membership program should you want a structured training designed to give anyone, including you, the opportunity to connect with the web of life with integrity, authenticity, and grounding. Because if we're going to reach that generative future, people, we have to do it by connecting with the rest of the world first, by asking, what do you want of me, and hearing clear, coherent, constructive answers that we can act on. We really need to let go of the idea that we can do this on our own, because I just don't think we can. So if you want pointers on how to connect, that's what the Accidental Gods program is about. So if you know of anyone else who would like to be active in being part of the generative dance of the world, do send them this link. And that's it for now. See you next week. Thank you, and goodbye.